Greetings and welcome back. In this third mini lecture, I want to go back a little bit to that domestic aspects of Britain and France, which you already know a lot about. I covered Britain in class. All of you have read the section on France and taken that exam. So just to repeat and to reiterate a few things. If we take a look at Britain and France, they do share, as I mentioned last time, widespread pacifism. The memory of World War I was traumatic, horrific. Both countries and both leaderships and both citizenry wanted to avoid a Second World War at nearly any cost. But domestically, the political situations of the two countries were incredibly different. Keep in mind that the Conservative Party governed by itself. It was not dependent on any alliance partners at all. They governed throughout the whole crisis, throughout the 1930s. In fact, the Conservatives were the governing party until 1945 when Clement Attlee pulled off that stunning victory in 1945, deposing Winston Churchill. And I talked about that at some length. The Conservative Party did this by, as I mentioned last time, relying on the pacifism of the people. And the political leaders ran as delegates, essentially promising the people what they knew they wanted to hear. In France, the domestic political landscape was incredibly different. Instead of single member district elections like still occur in Britain, in France at the time under the Third Republic, the French used proportional representation, which made the Third Republic very unstable. From 1932 to 1936, the French Chamber of Deputies was a splintered coalition of partners. The political continuum in France was much more polarized. There was extreme alienation, especially between a very radical and extreme French left and a very extreme and radical French right. The Chamber of Deputies from 1932 to 1936 had 13 different political parties represented, and none of them had the support of 30% of the legislature. And so it took multiple parties, five, six political parties in some cases, in order to govern the country. And that meant that if any one political party withdrew their political support, that government would fail. And so the result was very unstable coalitions, premiers, we call them, prime ministers in Britain, but the term premier in France means the same thing. At the time, keep in mind, under the Third and Fourth Republics, there was not a strong executive officer. There was no strong president like exists today under the Fifth Republic. So the French political situation was much more tenuous, and the article goes into some detail on that. The result of this, though, in this case, is that the splintered notion of the political system made a coherent political response, even during a time of crisis, difficult. And I would guide you to the top of page 115 in the article. I am reading from Cabinet Minister Paul Reynaud, who made a radio address to the French people after the crisis in 1938, crying out for national unity. This almost sounds like Charles de Gaulle, who at the time was a young tank commander and would be one of the few French military leaders to pose a significant resistance to the Nazis. But listen to this quote. France is making a terrible spectacle of herself. All the quarrels, all the rancor, all the bitterness of political strife have now come to the surface. Is it not time that we rise above ourselves, forget about our party and class differences, and become children of the same country, children of a country in danger? Can it be that France has lost its instinct of self-preservation? And the answer in this case, unfortunately, is yes. The the instability that existed in the French political system going all the way back to 1870 and ending in 1940 with the demise of the Third Republic, in case after case after case, the Third Republic was very weak and often did not have a coherent political response. But the failure to respond to Hitler emboldened him. If the French had resisted him in 1936, it could have meant the end of his dictatorship, and perhaps there wouldn't have been a Second World War in Europe. And yet, even when their own survival was threatened, they failed to respond. Now, in Britain, the criticism is obviously we have political leaders, Stanley Baldwin and Neville Chamberlain, who went around the country promising the policies that the people wanted, even though they themselves knew that this policy was dangerous. In other words, they allowed a misinformed British public to guide their policy to allow them to stay in political office longer. You see, the British politicians refused to make the hard choice as well. They chose their own re-election over making tough national security decisions. And here is Stanley Baldwin in his own words on page 115 when he told the House of Commons this: "You will remember the election at Fulham in the autumn of 1933 when a seat which the national government lost by 7,000 votes on no issue but the pacifist. My position as the leader of a great party was not a comfortable one. Suppose I had gone to the country and said that Germany was rearming and that we must rearm. Does anyone think that this pacifist democracy would have rallied to that cry at that moment? I cannot think of anything that would have made the loss of the election, from my point of view, more certain." In other words, this man confesses that I am a party leader and it is my job to win elections for my party. And what will get my party reelected is this policy of appeasement, non-rearmament. And he was reelected in the most smashing landslide in the history of Great Britain in the last 100 years. So both French leaders and British leaders let their own electorate down and left world civilization down. Listen to Winston Churchill's response. He says it would be wrong in judging the policy of the British government not to remember the passionate desire for peace which animated the uninformed, misinformed majority of the British people, and seemed to threaten with political extinction any party who dared to take any other line. In other words, he's saying to Stanley Baldwin that, yeah, you're right. If we had told people the truth, we would have lost the election. But listen to the rest of the quote. "This, of course, is no excuse for political leaders who fall short of their duty. It is much better for parties and politicians to be turned out of office than to imperil the life of the nation." In this case, we should have been trustees. We should have gone public and told the people they were wrong, and we should have loved our people enough to have given up our political careers to safeguard the lives of our people. And we didn't do that. And so the politicians of both countries let their people down. And so the implications of this are what? First, the British made a guarantee at Locarno that we're going to protect and maintain the western borders of Germany that they never had any intention to enforce at all. Second, France's alliances detracted from their strength. Thanks to alliance politics, the French did less to oppose Adolf Hitler and Nazi aggression than it was capable of doing all by itself. France was a far stronger actor than Germany in 1936. Instead, the French acted delusional, believing that the Locarno Pact was an affirmation of collaboration, that it was a mutual guarantee. And instead, the British interpretation of the Locarno guarantee was no. We are only going to come to your aid if France is invaded. And there is no indication that the French are under threat at all. And so they define this very, very differently. Third, the great tragedy in this whole story is that both the French and the British were not surprised at all by this occupation. Both the French, and star this multiple times, both the French and British expected Hitler's occupation. They had seen it coming, in fact, for years, and that a resolute response might have brought down his dictatorship. And let me just read you just a few lines again if you want to follow along on page 118. Reports began to trickle into Paris that Germany was going to reoccupy the Rhineland throughout 1935 and early 1936. A January 1936 meeting of the French Council of Ministers simply reaffirmed their 1932 decision to act only after securing a sanction from Geneva. The ministers felt that French retaliation against a German occupation would be too dangerous, and if Paris risked appearing to be the aggressor, France could find itself fighting Germany alone. Scroll down a paragraph. The British felt that remilitarization by Germany was inevitable. As early as 1935, the British War Office concluded that Germany was already capable of defending herself successfully. Indeed, their primary concern was to predict when the Wehrmacht would be able to launch an attack. Now, there is a secondary and the last implication that I want to give you here is that this crisis not only had an impact on Britain and on France, but on Eastern European countries. If you turn to page 120, you see Felix Gilbert's quote, and I think it is a very telling one. The militarization of the Rhineland upset the assumptions on which European statesmen had based their foreign policy. Germany's industrial area was no longer open to French attack, and her strengthened position would now have immediate repercussions in Eastern and Southeastern Europe. Many of the states of this region began to drift into the German orbit, perceiving the weakness of French character and determination. The various dictatorial regimes that developed in Poland, Yugoslavia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria now began to imitate fascist forms and methods, claiming that they represented a political spirit appropriate to the 20th century. As for Mussolini, his subsequent portrayal of fascism as a young international movement would triumph over the dying world of the democracies, and Mussolini now indicated he had chosen to move into the German camp. Now for us, today, something that I would ask you to consider in this last 45 seconds is, would your political leaders put their political survival above your self-interest? I'm not talking about any particular president or any particular political party, but many people believe that the number one motivation of our elected officials in a democratic society is re-election. And if that meant being re-elected at the threat of your national security, might some people do it? You see, it's funny to think that maybe this is just a French defect, but it might be a defect that occurs in many democratic societies.